We know Titanic from so many stories, even a movie, but now we have its first full-sized digital scan. And nope, it's not like those models from before, where we mostly imagined what the ship was supposed to be like. This time we got a real digital scan. A team of experts really mapped the deep-sea floor around the Titanic together with the ship itself. We basically got a 3D view of the entire wreck, which is like going deep down beneath the ocean's surface and seeing Titanic as if all the water has been drained away. So, the story of the wreck started in 1985, 73 years after the Titanic went down. The explorer named Robert Ballard stumbled upon it somewhere between two submarines that also went down in that area. He was actually on a different task back then, so he didn't even have time to explore the ship properly. But as he was searching for the submarines, he realized how ocean currents affect sinking debris. He noticed the heaviest object sank quickly and left a trail of debris behind, the trail that followed the currents. Using this knowledge, Ballard made a hypothesis the Titanic had broken in two and left a debris trail as it sank. Before he found the wreck, everyone thought the ship just went down in one piece after hitting an iceberg. So everyone knew where the ship was so the adventure could start, or not. It was hard to explore it. The ship is enormous, and the dark depths of the ocean make it really difficult to capture its whole body in one go. So we mostly relied on glimpses of the decaying ship, and had to settle with teasing scattered parts of the whole picture and filling it up with speculations and stories. But in the summer of 2022, we finally got something different. A team of experts from Magellan Loaded, a company specializing in mapping the deep sea, teamed up with Atlantic Productions, who were making a documentary about the project. They embarked on a mission to capture the complete view of the Titanic. They used submersibles. Those are vehicles that go underwater, remotely controlled by a team of skilled explorers. These submersibles dove deep into the ocean. It wasn't an easy job. They spent over 200 hours collecting information about the entire length and breadth of the wreck. It was like a real-life treasure hunt. But instead of finding gold and jewels, they took something even more precious. Over 700,000 images of the Titanic from every angle possible. Yup, they took photos of every tiny part of the ship, even the not-so-interesting bits most of us would usually skip. Even mapping the muddy parts was an important part, because it helped fill in the gaps between the more exciting things they discovered. And this was a way for all of us to finally get a detailed 3D reconstruction. Even though it's been more than 100 years, you can still recognize the bow of the Titanic, covered in rust that hangs down like stalactites. On top of the bow is the boat deck, where a big hole gives us a glimpse into the empty space where the grand staircase once stood, like a window into the ship's glamorous past. Its stern is now a wild mess of twisted metal. As the Titanic went down, this part collapsed and spiraled into the seabed. The bow and the stern ended up separated by about 2,600 feet. There's a vast field of debris surrounding this giant, stuck on the seafloor. This debris is like a scattered treasure trove, full of intricate metalwork from the ship, statues, and even unopened champagne bottles. There are also personal belongings that went down together with the ship, like dozens of shoes resting across the seafloor. It was a tough task to do, go down and take all those pictures. It may not sound that hard at first, considering it was the vehicle that really immersed itself into such deep parts of the ocean, not the people. But studying the ocean is hard. We haven't explored, mapped, or even seen over 80% of it. The conditions are harsh, and the pressure becomes more intense the deeper you go. And their vehicle had to dive down to nearly 13,120 feet below the surface. That's like 12 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other. Plus, you have strong currents in that area, so it was probably like trying to navigate through a watery maze. And submersibles weren't supposed to touch anything. Even the slightest wrong step can damage the wreck that was already so fragile. It seems like the Titanic is frozen in time, so it will always be there waiting for us. But in reality, it's slowly disappearing. It's pretty obvious that the ocean water ruined it considering how long it has been down there. But it's not just that. The wreck itself has become a home for a specific type of Bacteria Halomonas titanicae that even got named after the famous ship. These bacteria have a special ability. They can survive inside rusty formations known as rusticles. They kind of look like icicles, those spikes of ice that form when water falls from something and freezes. These bacteria have a taste for iron, which is abundant in the ship's hull. For them, it's like a real buffet down there. And as time goes by, These bacteria will keep eating away at the iron in the ship, bit by bit, until one day the feast comes to an end and the whole ship is gone. It's like a slow but steady recycling process. So this 3D model we got because of the hardworking team and technology comes at the best time because we never know how much time we have left with exploring the famous wreck. This time we might even understand the collision with the iceberg better. You know how movies always show the Titanic hitting the iceberg on its right side? Well, we can't even be certain about that. The scans could help us figure out if the ship actually grounded on the iceberg, like getting stuck on it. We can study the stern and analyze how the Titanic struck the seafloor. That will also help us understand what really happened during the sinking. Maybe we'll get a chance to discover if there was really a strong fire that sealed the fate of the Titanic. One theory says that the coal fire had been raging for a whole 3 weeks before the ship even took its first and last trip. And this could have made its hull weaker, which means most of the work was done. The iceberg just delivered the final blow, if there even was an iceberg, as some people wonder. There's an alternative theory they suggested where the Titanic may have actually hit a hidden mass of pack ice instead of a typical iceberg. Pack ice is made up of large sheets of ice that float near the ocean's surface and can be difficult to spot. They believe this pack ice might have drifted into the Atlantic from the Arctic Ocean. According to one professional mariner, Captain L.M. Collins, that stands up with that idea. If the Titanic had struck a regular iceberg, the ship would have sunk much more quickly than it did. And since the Titanic managed to stay on the surface for a relatively long period of time, less than 3 hours, maybe this was a different type of collision. The mariner also said there are differences in what people said they saw when the Titanic sank. He thinks these differences might be because of optical illusions. In this case, when people were looking at the ocean that night, the way the light was reflecting and the conditions at sea might have made things appear closer or distorted. So when they saw something in the water, it might not have been exactly what they thought it was. Whether it was an iceberg or something else. Binoculars might have helped the crew members to spot the potential danger, but unfortunately, they didn't have any. It appears they were locked inside a cabinet, and no one knew where the key was.
Have you ever wondered how much of the Titanic is left these days? Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, you probably know that it's been over 100 years since the world's most famous ship turned into a wreck. The RMS Titanic, the world's largest sea liner from the beginning of the 1900s, sank during its maiden voyage, just a few days after leaving port. The ship struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, taking down over 1,500 passengers of more than 2,200 who were on board the liner at that time. As shocking as this may sound, the Titanic took over 3 years to be built and only 3 hours to sink. And if it were today, the ship would have cost over $210 million to be made. It was last seen on the surface of the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m., and for many decades, that was the last time people saw it. It wasn't until 1985 that the whereabouts of the ship were discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard, and some parts of the Titanic became visible once again. One of the first discoveries made by Ballard's expedition was that the ship was indeed torn in half before sinking. The early exploratory missions to the part of the ocean floor where the Titanic now lies could only see the hull and the deck of the ship. According to Ballard, the main purpose of these missions was to understand how to preserve the ruins from deteriorating. Another goal was to recover the huge number of personal items scattered along the seabed. The explorer later said the view down there was as shocking as it was emotional. In the field of debris around the wreck, the oceanographer discovered plenty of small objects and personal belongings, many of which he brought back to the surface. There were shoes, some fancier than others. There were pieces of clothing that belonged to crew members, and there were huge propellers. If on the surface they gleamed and shined, on the ocean floor they were embedded and devoured by sand. Ballard pointed out that the area where kitchenware was scattered measured more than a mile in length. There were enough plates, pots, and pans to fill up an entire industrial kitchen. For the first time ever, 3D animation footage reveals exciting images. The simulations show the Titanic's evolution from when she first set sail in 1912 until the state of her ruins today. But simulations weren't enough for deep-sea explorer James Cameron. who envisioned traveling to the heart of the wreck for the first time ever in the history of the ship. Yep, the same James Cameron who happens to be the director of a very famous movie about the ship. He has now dived 33 times to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Here's some fun trivia for you. The director says that his true passion has always been the ocean, and that ever since he was a kid, he wanted to study the sea. Directing, let's say, just happened to be his day job. And when the possibility of directing Titanic appeared, he said yes, just so that he could go and check out the ruins of the ship in real life. Now back to the wreck. According to James Cameron, it wasn't enough for researchers to access only the exterior of the ship. They needed to go inside, analyze and photograph what was left of the pompous interiors of the world's once biggest sea liner. Cameron piloted an innovative robot vehicle equipped with cameras. It helped the man to reveal spaces in the Titanic that no one had ever seen before since the ship touched the bottom. Turkish baths, for instance, still had their tiled walls standing up almost in all their entirety. These baths were exclusively for first-class passengers. They were located right next to the swimming bath and the third-class dining room, and were designed in the Moorish style. People resting there could get heating blankets and ask waiters to bring them anything they needed. If the pictures from before the disaster were astonishing, they carry a different kind of wow factor now, when everything you see in them is hidden underneath the surface of the water. Another shocking discovery was the ship's mast. If we look at the Titanic in its pre-sinking glory, the mast calls much of one's attention. Located on the bow of the huge ship, the mast held together the transmission cables for the Marconi system, a system of wireless telegraphy. That's also where the British merchant flag the Titanic flew was located. The mast stood at the height of a bit more than 100 feet and was equipped with a crow's nest. Nowadays, the mast is unrecognizable. Attacked by corrosion, it collapsed. The crow's nest broke apart too. Now we can see why the modern-day Titanic is a real treasure for deep-sea explorers. But as the wreck of the ship lies at an approximate depth of 12,500 feet, sunlight is non-existent there. So, piloted missions depend on high-end technological equipment to survey the area. Why do you think the Titanic went missing from the public eye for over 70 years? Well, because at that time, technology wasn't advanced enough for people to go down there, as well as bring back good footage of the wreck. Filmmakers were the ones who drove this technology to its advance by trying to film underwater. They began by building boxes to put their cameras inside. And now, deep-sea photography is highly advanced and allows us to marvel at the awesomeness of underwater life. Of course, taking pictures under the sea is no easy feat. For one thing, to withstand that crazy underwater pressure, submarines need to be really strong and have thick walls, no thinner than 11 inches. Plus, explorers need to understand how to film and photograph when there's almost no light around. There was another thing that made documenting the Titanic even more difficult. When the wreck of the ship was rediscovered by scientists, it was covered with red-colored rusty bacteria that made it even harder to take good pictures. As it happens, the color red does not reflect well underwater, which is unfortunate for photographers. For this reason, human-operated vehicles that go down to tour the ruins are equipped with powerful lighting devices. When you see some parts of the ship from afar, they look as if reddish-brown wax has been dripping all over the Titanic's ruins. But in reality, these icicle-shaped structures are colonies of microorganisms. When the ship sank, it brought down with it an enormous amount of bacteria that hadn't existed at the bottom of the ocean before. But now, these bacteria, together with the extreme conditions at the bottom of the ocean, have turned into a disastrous combination for the ruins of the ship. These red colonies of microorganisms actually feed off of iron and steel, which is basically all that is left of the Titanic. One kind of those microorganisms are bacteria called Halomonas titanicae. They can eat up to 220 pounds of iron per day. This makes the Titanic a colossal food source for them. There have been lots of speculations regarding the life expectancy of the ship's wreck after researchers discovered this bizarre rust. But according to Cameron and his research team, the Titanic isn't going to disintegrate anytime soon. In one of the latest expeditions down to the wreck, a piloted vehicle was funded to identify specifically one stateroom. It belonged to a very important passenger, Sir Benjamin Guggenheim. Yes, just like the museum. Guggenheim was the son of a mining magnate and a member of the elite group that boarded the transatlantic journey of the Titanic. Born in Philadelphia, Guggenheim was traveling back home to the US. But, as we all know, he never made it to his final destination. For the price that ranged from 400 to 800 pounds back in 1912, the equivalent of 84,000 pounds nowadays, one could book accommodation that was called a stateroom. Staterooms on the Titanic were the most luxurious kind of first-class rooms. They were located on the B or C decks and were decorated in more than 11 different styles, ranging from Jacobean, Georgian, Italian Renaissance, and the list goes on. These rooms were filled with carved paneling and marquetry made from exotic and rare kinds of wood, such as mahogany, oak, and so on. Guggenheim occupied one of these luxurious rooms, and 100 years later, one of his descendants funded an entire mission just to locate the precise stateroom the man stayed in. This expedition turned into a documentary for National Geographic, and they did manage to identify which stateroom was Guggenheim's, so kudos for them.
April 14th, 1912. The Titanic crashed into a huge iceberg and sank. Yep, we've covered that. But what if this time we use the ice to bring the ship to the surface? This requires several thousand feet of wire mesh and a lot of liquid nitrogen. Our goal is to put the Titanic in a huge block of ice that will raise the ship to the surface. Now to do this, you need to wrap the wreck in a wire mesh and cover it with liquid nitrogen. The first problem you face is the inability to wrap the ship completely. You need to somehow lift the ship a little to put the mesh under it. Let's say that by some miracle you manage to do so. Next, you need to transport hundreds of large tanks of liquid nitrogen. You're underwater, opening the tanks, and it's so cold that the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean looks like it's boiling. The nitrogen just sizzles, dissipates, and certainly doesn't create a block of ice around the mesh. Alright, new attempt. Raise the Titanic with the help of huge magnets. For this, you need a large cruiser and some powerful magnets. You attach thick cables to the magnets and lower them to the bottom. Bright projectors illuminate the black ocean depths. Parts of the wreck are visible. The magnets descend lower and cling to the iron hull of the ship. The cruiser pulls the cables and magnets up. Some of them detach from the Titanic as the iron surface is covered with reefs and corals. Some parts of the wreck break away from the ship and rise. The power of the cruiser is not enough. One of the cables is torn. Not only the weight of the individual parts of the Titanic, but also the colossal water pressure interferes with the operation. The sunken ship can't be raised completely, only its small parts. In reality, there has already been an attempt to raise the Titanic in parts. The $5 million operation failed. Nylon slings were attached to a large part of the wreck. The other ends of the slings were connected to the diesel engines. For the entire operation, they used a mini submarine. A piece of the Titanic weighing 21 tons was pulled up, but one of the slings broke because of the strong water pressure. Then, one by one, the other cables began to snap, and a huge piece fell back to the seafloor. By this time, all the participants of the rescue operation had run out of food supplies, and it was far from the nearest shore, so they decided not to make a second attempt. A book was written and a movie was made about how the Titanic was lifted with compressed air. In reality, no one even attempted this operation. To do this, you'd need several hundred large cylinders of compressed air. At first, you install them inside the Titanic's hull and wait for them to pull the ship to the surface. As soon as you lower the cylinders under the water, they immediately float upwards. This greatly complicates the operation. You need to fasten the cylinders with cables and pull them down to the bottom using a powerful submarine, or better yet, several of them. Because of the high pressure, the cylinders might burst. In this case, the blast wave would hit other cylinders and provoke a catastrophe. Too expensive and unsafe. The most expensive and complex plan to raise the Titanic is probably the one where scientists somehow extract hydrogen and oxygen from the ocean water. Then, these extracted elements must fill special containers. Those containers are attached to the ship, and the Titanic would rise to the surface. Even if you extract oxygen and hydrogen from millions of tons of water, the rest of the ocean water will replace it. A machine that will be capable of such filtering should cost billions of dollars. Or you can come up with a chemical element that will use a chain reaction to purify all the water. In this case, the entire world ocean will be left without vital oxygen. Someone once suggested blowing up the Titanic. You'd need to lower several boxes of dynamite to the ocean floor. The boxes must be completely sealed to prevent the dynamite from getting wet. Next, you need to run several miles of wire conducting an electrical current to them. Once all this is done, you sail to a safe distance. Now, you're going to press the button to pass the current through the wire and activate the dynamite. 3, 2, 1, stop! Why would you do this? Even if it works, the wreckage of the Titanic will be scattered in all directions on the seabed. It will be impossible to lift the Titanic from the ocean. Imagine a huge hook that can fetch the Titanic and lift it from the bottom like a fish. This hook must be huge to pick up a sunken ship. Let's say you created it. Next, you're on a huge cruiser, sailing up to the crash site and lowering the hook down like an anchor. It falls right on the Titanic but doesn't cling to it. You need special equipment to attach a bus-sized hook to the Titanic. It would include a huge submarine with mechanical arms. To build such a device and make it work under enormous pressure is already next to impossible. But let's say you finally managed to hook the Titanic. It's then you realize the cruiser doesn't have enough power to lift the ship, weighing more than 50 tons, and the hook that adds about 10 tons more. To complete your task, you'll need a few more cruisers and a few extra $1 million. Once hot wax cools, it hardens and floats on the water surface. What if we deliver it to the ocean floor and pour it inside the Titanic? This may work, given that wax is not an expensive material. So, you melt the wax, pour it into strong tanks, and pull them to the bottom with the help of a submarine. The tanks can withstand enormous pressure, and the submarine has enough power to lower the wax to such a depth. The containers are placed inside the Titanic. Through a remote control, you open the containers, but the wax doesn't pour out. The deeper you go, the colder the water gets. While you were delivering the containers to the ship, the wax was cooling down and getting solid inside. Several containers are pressed against the top of the ship, but it's not enough to lift the Titanic. Other containers simply float away to the surface. And even if the containers were thermostatic and kept hot inside all the time, once released, the wax would solidify in an instant. There would just be no time for it to spread and cover the Titanic from within, so it would just float up as well. Alright, you fill several large and sturdy bags with Vaseline. This substance acts just like wax in the cold. It gets solid and floats. You want to put bags all over the Titanic and just wait for the Vaseline to bring it up. You load the bags into the submarine and descend to the ocean floor. Some parts of the ship can't be reached because of the clinging corals. You decide to unload all the bags in one place, but as soon as you take Vaseline out of the submarine, the bags tear due to the strong pressure. Solid pieces of Vaseline float up, pushed by the water. Mission failed. The craziest idea is to fill the Titanic with millions of ping pong balls. Small plastic balls filled with air should push the ship to the surface. But as soon as you start to lower them to the bottom, the plastic immediately flattens and all the air from the balls pops out. You can deliver the balls inside a submarine, but once you put them inside the Titanic, the pressure will crush them again. Also, you can create balls made from strong ultralight material and fill them with air. In this case, you will need much more money. As soon as you put the balls inside the ship, some of them will immediately slip through the holes in the ship, and the remaining ones won't be enough to lift the wreck weighing more than 50 tons from the bottom. Well, to study the Titanic, you don't need to go down to the ocean floor. On the internet, you can find a detailed 3D map that shows the wreck site, as well as the ship itself on the seabed. To get a realistic picture of the Titanic, researchers used sonar technologies and underwater robots, which took more than 10,000 pictures of the sunken ship. So, what do you think? Leave it alone? Yeah, me too. On April 10, 1912, crowds gathered at Southampton Beach to wave off what was, at the time, the world's largest and most prestigious ship, the RMS Titanic. The cost of the most expensive first-class parlor ticket was $4,350. That's around $70,000 in today's money. But barely 5 days after steaming away, the ship was swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. So let's rewind and go back to what actually happened on that fateful night. The captain wanted to set a speed record for the ship's maiden voyage and arrive early. The ship was deemed unsinkable, so he went full throttle into the dark Arctic waters. After spotting the 100-foot iceberg, the crew desperately tried to steer the vessel away and avoid the collision, but the Titanic was traveling too fast, and the iceberg tore down the side of the ship, creating a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. In total, the damage spanned along an area of around 300 feet. But the ship's designers had prepared for the prospect of a collision and added watertight compartments down each side of the ship to act as a buffer zone. 4 of these compartments could be breached and the ship would still stay afloat. But because the iceberg tore down the side of the Titanic, it ripped holes in 6 compartments. The compartments didn't extend up the total height of all decks and weren't actually sealed at the top. This is why, when more than 4 were flooded, water reached over the top of the bulkheads and filled the remaining compartments, causing the ship to sink into the ocean. Think of it as water spilling over an ice cube tray. But what if the collision was head-on? Would it still have sunk? Ships are designed with potential crashes in mind, and most vessels have collision bulkheads in the bow. Most of all, it's like your car's bumper or crumple zone. It's a safety feature that can withstand a direct hit. The bow could have taken some of the impact, and some experts have suggested that if it hit head-on, only 2 to 4 of the watertight compartments would have been flooded. So, in theory, the Titanic might not have sunk, and it might have even been able to continue sailing to its final destination at a much slower speed. The force of impact would likely have been huge, though. But although passengers would have been injured by the force, they'd have been able to stay on the ship to wait to be rescued by other ships, rather than being forced into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Still, one of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, suggested that the force of the impact might not have actually been that big. He told the British Inquiry that lots of people scarcely felt the collision, and he believed the ship would not have sunk if it did hit the iceberg head-on. The ship was also designed with remotely operated watertight doors between all compartments, so any floods could have been quickly sorted out. Because Titanic had 6 breaches from the side collision, and because it happened so quickly, sealing the doors wouldn't have made a difference, as it was essentially impossible to save it by that point. The ship immediately began to flood, with water pouring in at a rate of roughly 7 tons per second, 15 times faster than it could be pumped out. So, while it sounds like the Titanic would have survived had the ship hit the iceberg head-on, this idea does come with some issues. First off, the collision bulkheads were designed to survive a crash with another ship, not a giant iceberg. If 2 ships collided, both would absorb some of the impact in their bulkheads, sharing the impact and likely staying afloat. But an iceberg is stationary, meaning that Titanic would absorb most of the energy from the collision. If Titanic hit head first, because of the speed it was traveling, the impact would have likely traveled down the whole body of the ship. Just imagine a 46,000-ton ship traveling at around 20 knots. At some point, it hits an iceberg that weighs what could be over 100,000 tons. This collision would likely create a powerful force causing massive damage to the vessel. It is likely that seams would split, staircases would come tumbling down, and rivets would burst open across the ship. All that would have potentially flooded even more compartments. This could have caused Titanic to sink in a matter of minutes rather than hours. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. As we all know, the biggest part of it is hidden underwater. So if Titanic had been traveling head-on, it's likely it would have hit the part of the iceberg below the water first, which would send it veering off course. Hitting an iceberg is not like hitting a brick wall. In this case, the ice under the water would have torn open the bottom of the ship and caused damage to the sides. Icebergs also aren't flat, solid objects. If a flat collision happened, the ship might have stayed afloat, but icebergs come in many shapes and sizes, from domes to wedges. Studies have also been done on the steel used to produce Titanic, and the tests show the metal was about 10 times more brittle than the steel we use today. The ship was built before we understood the effects of low temperature on steel. The old steel used to make the vessel would not bend when faced with freezing temperatures, but break. Recovered pieces of Titanic's hull plates show that the hull just shattered on impact. Hitting head-on would also cause a very severe and abrupt stop, so even if the ship hadn't sunk, there would still have been major issues. Think about when you suddenly hit the brakes on your car, or when the bus stops while you're walking down the aisle and you get flung forward. Passengers would have been thrown across the ship, and because the crash happened at night, most people were sleeping, so wouldn't be able to effectively prepare for any sort of impact. This would result in injuries for most people on board. It would be especially bad for those at the front of the ship, where the accommodation for the off-duty firefighters, greasers, and engineers was. But while passengers and off-duty crew may have been thrown out of bed, there would be a lot more survivors than in the original scenario. Many ships have had head-on collisions and made it back to shore. Not many people know that Titanic actually had two sister ships. The White Star Line, the company that built Titanic, also built vessels called Britannic and Olympic. Captained by Edward J. Smith, who would later helm Titanic, the Olympic set off on its maiden voyage in June 1911. But much like Ford's sister ship, disaster was just around the corner. On its fifth commercial voyage, Olympic collided with a Royal Navy ship, HMS Hawke. While the Olympic received damage to its side, Hawke crashed into the other vessel head-on. The bow of the Hawke was completely crushed by the collision, but because the ship had watertight compartments, it managed to survive the impact and later returned to shore for repair. Another study case is the SS Andrea Doria, which was an Italian ocean liner that made global headlines in 1956. Like the Titanic, the Andrea Doria was heading for New York City on its 101st voyage when disaster struck. On July 25th, the vessel collided with the 524-foot Swedish passenger liner Stockholm. The Stockholm hit the ship head-on, but the point of impact for the Andrea Doria was on its side. The front of the Stockholm was completely smashed, but because the impact was on its hull, it managed to survive. The Andrea Doria, however, sadly sank due to the collision being on the side of the ship. So these cases could suggest that maybe the Titanic would have survived had it hit the iceberg head-on. But we have to remember that the Titanic hit the thing full speed, whereas both the Olympic and the Andrea Doria were traveling slower. In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the fourth was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the soot being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The two parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and his captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the Sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. and now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you, though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
John watched on in disbelief as he drifted away on a piece of wood. In the freezing waters of the Arctic, slowly drifting away. John looked upon the vessel he had worked and lived on as it raised its enormous bow high into the sky, then broke in half, causing a sound that only a crack of lightning could replicate. Distraught and dumbstruck, believing that he, and he alone, knew the dark truth behind the demise of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. 5 days earlier, as the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, John worked hard alongside his mates in the coal bunker, stocking up the coal to feed the Titanic's mighty furnace. They had stocked and stored more than John had ever witnessed on any other ship he'd worked on. But this was the Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed the seas. On the Titanic, there could never be too much coal. As they left Belfast and pushed toward Southampton, there was a large bang below decks that went unnoticed. The furnace was roaring and the turbines were spinning, pushing the Titanic forward at a quickened pace. The crew cheered as the vessel moved forward, unaware of the loud, concerning noise. Arriving in Southampton, Greg came aboard, amongst hundreds of other passengers. With 13 years at sea, his vast experience included the role as a quartermaster on 6 previous ships. Ready for a new challenge aboard the greatest vessel ever made, he was looking forward to this next challenge of his career. Greg came with a wealth of experience, especially with sailing through the Arctic. His role was vital within the crew, understanding the seas around the North Pole. He would be a key lookout as they set to cross the perilous path of the Iceberg Alley. Greg had some concerns regarding the voyage. The Earth's orbit was remarkably close to the Sun and the Moon, causing higher tides. This would make icebergs more prominent, drifting them further away and towards the route of the Titanic as they journeyed to New York. Assessing the lookout tower and inspecting the available gear, Greg found no binoculars. This made him concerned, but the sailors just laughed at Greg.
"If the deck is short on ice cubes, we'll be sure to plow right through a berg to resupply."
A sailor laughed. Greg didn't share this sentiment. Eager to find out why they had been left short-handed on equipment, since he had such a vital role on the ship, Greg inquired further. Sadly, the officer with the keys to the binocular supply cupboard had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Greg couldn't believe something of this importance had been overlooked. For such a mighty ship with so many people aboard and crossing in a particularly perilous path, this just didn't make sense. But not wanting to be fined for breaking into the ship's property, Greg let it slide, hoping that they wouldn't need the binoculars in the end. Ultimately, if there were icebergs expected, a warning call would be made to the captain, informing of any concerns. Little did Greg know that a warning had been received, notifying of the dangers that awaited. But the telegram didn't provide the required prefix, which would have ensured direct delivery to the captain. So, the critical warning was just overlooked. John and his crew below decks prepared for departure, stoking the engines. He noticed an essence of thick exhaust, far too heavy than what would be expected from the furnaces. The crew searched throughout the lower decks. Following a thorough search, they managed to locate the cause of the exhaust. It was an ignited pile of coal within a coal bunker. Unknown when it had ignited, a buildup of coal had clearly been smoldering, slowly growing in size. The amount of smoldering coal was concerning. The alarm was raised, alerting an officer to review the matter. The officer assessed the damage and confirmed with the captain that it was deemed to be of little concern, as only minor damage had been caused. John was unsure of this assessment, as he knew that in confined spaces, surrounded by iron bulkheads, an oven-like environment arises that intensifies the heat with time. But the Titanic would power forward, making no sense to John as they had only just departed from Southampton. He was sure they would have turned back. John and his crew were ordered to shovel the already lit coal into the furnace and continue shoveling until all the smoldering contents would be contained. It was a possible but painstaking task that could take the entire journey. The continuous intake of coal would ensure the turbines would spin at a constant, accelerated pace, not what the Titanic was designed for. It was meant to be a luxurious passenger liner and not for breaking speed records. However, the crew would find enthusiasm in not only acknowledging the Titanic as unsinkable, but also as the fastest. John and his crew continued to shovel the coal into the furnace for several days. The temperature within the bow was becoming hotter every day. The bulkhead's contained heat was so severe that it became weak at the seams in the iron walls and rivets.
2 more days, lads, just 2 more days.
John was laughing, trying to raise the spirits of his mates as they were working tirelessly. But as they were all laughing, joking, and looking forward to dry land, they unknowingly approached their final destination. The Titanic was speeding through the calm sea. Greg looked ahead, above in the lookout tower, keeping a keen eye out as they were in iceberg territory now. Even though the way seemed clear, false horizons could occur, creating confusion about how far objects in the distance truly were. As they were traveling in the Gulf Stream waters into the colder Labrador Current, air columns cooled from the bottom upwards, creating a thermal inversion. This incredibly high air pressure ensured fog wasn't present, providing a deceptively clear outlook. But the thermal inversion can also create optical illusions, showing the horizon further away, appearing higher in the distance, or masking whatever objects that could come before it. These false horizons could easily hide any icebergs that could be approaching. Greg knew the perils of a calm sea in the Arctic, preferring the rough waters, where it's easier to detect icebergs within waves. Peering from the lookout, Greg was looking towards the dark abyss ahead. Suddenly, within 1 mile directly in front, a formidable image quickly emerged from the dark waters surrounding. "Iceberg, right ahead!" Greg yelled to his mate, who quickly called to the helm and directed them to steer hard to starboard. The helmsman received the call. In the heat of the moment, he turned the wheel counterclockwise. He then realized he'd turned the wheel the wrong way and quickly went in the opposite direction. The ship aimed towards the iceberg, veering to the port side whilst reducing speed. Although there was a delay in turning the wheel, since there was a short distance from the signal and the fast pace that they sailed at, it may not have made a difference. As they approached the iceberg, it appeared as though they'd miss it, but over 87% of an iceberg is underwater. And as they came along the side, the hidden ice underneath hit the port side bow, piercing the side of the hull with a 12-square-foot tear. The ship shook, with all aboard aware that something was amiss. Amongst the confusion and fear, they were oblivious of the damage. As they gathered their bearings, 6 out of 16 compartments were quickly filling up with seawater. The hull could only withstand 4 compartments filling before sinking. Time was ticking as the Titanic made its descent into the depths. The weakened bulkhead with heated steel pillars and rivets broke under the pressure and sudden change of temperature from the ice-cold water. The call was made to abandon the ship. Lifeboats were prepared to be released, while help signals were sent out to nearby ships. The radio operator was guiltily sitting, constantly calling out to a nearby ship that had been in contact with the Titanic recently. There was steady communication with this ship over the past few days, providing warnings of icebergs since the Titanic departed from Southampton. The final warning message received was just 1 hour ago. Upon receiving the final warning, the operator ignorantly responded, "Shut up," with the assumption that their warnings of icebergs were pointless. Following this unfortunate response, the ship turned their radio off and provided radio silence. The closest ship that was responding to their distress signals was 500 miles away, too far to provide any assistance in time. There were countless mistakes that caused the Titanic's watery end, whether they contributed directly or from sheer ignorance. The most tragic of them was the number of people aboard the ship, 2,224 of them. There were only enough lifeboats provided to rescue 1,178, barely half of the people.
It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidore started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidore and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidore didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting. The Royal Mail Ship, or RMS Titanic, easily the most famous steamship in history, was once the symbol of luxury and dreams that promised to come true. It took 3 years and 3,000 people to construct it. On April 10, 1912, the brand-new ocean liner greeted its passengers with the smell of fresh varnish, paint, and newly sawn wood. Back then, they still used lead for the production of paint and linseed oil as a binder, so that smell must have been powerful. When it was fully operational, the giant vessel consumed around 850 tons of coal per day, and the passengers would also smell its fumes. Another odor that must have filled the Titanic's decks, at least the first-class ones, was the new scent by the famous French perfume house Guerlain. It was released earlier in the same year and quickly became a hit with the well-off ladies. The perfume that you can still buy today is a mix of violets and iris with creamy vanilla. On the dramatic evening of April 14th, when Titanic only had hours to live, the unknowing waiters were serving oysters, lamb and mint sauce, roast duck with applesauce, and other delicacies to their first-class guests. The second class was filled with the smells of curried chicken, spring lamb, and roast turkey. Third-class passengers had simple gruel and biscuits that night. At 11 p.m., as the ship got dangerously close to the iceberg, the new smell added to the mix. It was a mineral odor with metallic notes. If you have ice in your fridge, you must have noticed it takes the smell of neighboring foods. The same happens to icebergs. They take on the odors of sea animals and maintain the chemical composition of the water that they're made of. If more people had known about the meaning of this particular metallic smell, they probably still wouldn't have saved the ship, but the number of people that managed to escape to safety could have been larger. Speaking of smells, in case you've ever wondered what space smells like but aren't planning to become an astronaut anytime soon, listen up. You can try out Ode to Space, an aroma that was designed by NASA decades ago. The idea of the perfume was to help astronauts prepare for their encounters with space at all levels during their training. But hold on a second, space is a vacuum, so it technically shouldn't have any smell. Yet, astronauts who have been out there remembered it as a pleasant metallic odor, something like the smell of welding fumes or burnt gunpowder. They could smell it on their spacesuits after coming back into their spacecraft. We can also guess what other planets smell like based on what their atmospheres are made of. Venus has clouds of sulfuric acid in its atmosphere, so it must smell like rotten eggs. Mars and Uranus also smell like rotten eggs, by the way. Each of the layers of Jupiter's atmosphere is made up of different chemicals. That's why it smells different depending on where you are. Some layers would greet you with a yummy aroma of bitter almonds or marzipan, and others, closer to the top, smell like cleaning products. The remaining planets of the solar system are unlikely to have a distinctive scent because they're mostly odorless gases in their atmospheres. As for our natural satellite, the Moon, the Apollo astronauts claim that its dust smells like gunpowder. The fragrance of fresh-cut grass makes regular mowing it nearly worth it. But did you know that the grass isn't having a great time while you're doing it? In fact, it's sort of screaming for help. And because grass can't scream out loud, it expresses discomfort by releasing a mix of smelly, volatile molecules. It does it to protect itself from insects. Caterpillars and other similar creatures just love to munch on sugary plant snacks. When you mow the grass, it releases jasmonic acid, among other things. It's sort of a signal to parasitic wasps that there is a caterpillar available. These creatures deal with the grass's offenders, and it can keep growing happily ever after. From the point of view of the grass, mowing is not much different from an insect attack, so it protects itself the best way it can. The rain has an easy-to-recognize powerful smell, also known as petrichor. But where does it come from? Turns out some plants secrete oils during drought. The rocks and soil accumulate those oils compounds, and when the raindrops hit, they mix with water and release into the air. Sometimes these oils combine with chemicals produced by bacteria living in the soil. The result of this cooperation is a musky odor you can smell in the woods or in your garden when you turn over the wet soil. Ozone also adds to the smell of rain, especially after thunderstorms. It happens when a lightning bolt's electrical charge splits oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere, and they later recombine into ozone. One theory says we enjoy the aroma of rain so much because it's imprinted in our brains. Different cultures have always associated rain with something positive, and we could have inherited that perception. Now, chocolate fans, of which I am one, this is for you. There are flowers that smell exactly like your favorite treat. It's a product of a tropical plant, after all, and since it's impossible to recreate the exact magical scent chocolate has in a perfume, you can plant some chocolate flowers, also known as the green eye lyra leaves, in your garden. These flowers look like daisies with yellow petals around a deep red center. When you pick its petals, the flower releases the delicious smell we all love so much. The leaves and branches of the plant also have the same fragrance. Now, in case I got you interested, you can find the flower in dry soils of Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and other states with similar climates. It blooms all year, and the aroma is strongest on warm days. The bear cat, also known as the biturong, does not only look super cute, but also smells like buttered popcorn. Biturongs prefer to stay alone and use their aroma to mark their territory and find potential partners when they have to. Scientists tried to figure out the secret of their unusual smell and suggested it could come from secretions from the scent glands under the animal's tail. Further research showed that the popcorn smell comes from the bear cat's urine. After the animal answers nature's call, it leaves a scent trail in the trees with its tail that often gets soaked. But if the real popcorn only releases its amazing smell when it's popping under heat, how do bear cats manage to do it without a microwave? Well, the answer could be in their diet, or more likely, in the bacteria that come in contact with the animal's natural fluid. Durian is a fruit popular in Southeast Asia that smells sweet and nice to some people, but to the majority, it's a mix of rotten onions and sweaty socks. The stench is so powerful that it's banned on public transportation and hotels in some countries. The secret of durian is its 44 odor-active components. The mix is so complex that you can never tell what it's going to smell like. And despite that horrible smell, durian is considered a delicacy and is used to make mostly sweet dishes like cakes and candy. There was a smelly incident involving durian at a library in Australia. The smell of rotting fruit in a cupboard has spread across the entire building through the air conditioning system. They mistook it for gas leakage and had to evacuate around 500 students and teachers. Well, that stinks. And finally, if you've ever been to natural hot springs or went to see some geysers, you'll never forget the smell of hydrogen sulfide, or less poetically, rotten eggs. It's actually not only yucky but also highly flammable, but it can also be quite useful. Most households in Iceland use geothermal springs as a source of hot water. Although it doesn't smell fresh, it's perfectly safe to drink, and the smell doesn't stay on your body after you take a shower. So there.
On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail from England. But this wasn't the launch of a regular ship. The Titanic was the largest liner ever built at the time. It was 882 feet long. That's nearly the size of 3 soccer fields. And measured from the hull to the top of the smokestacks, the ship was an impressive 175 feet tall. That's the size of a 17-story building. Deemed unsinkable, it took 3,000 workers almost 3 years to build. But a mere 4 days into its very first voyage, at 11:40 p.m., the ship collided with an iceberg and was lost beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. It took the liner only 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. And of more than 2,200 passengers and crew members on board, only 706 survived. The wreck would remain lost for another 73 years, hiding its many secrets within the frigid Atlantic waters. And if it wasn't for a man whose whole life had been devoted to exploring the sea, the giant ship might have remained lost for a lot longer. That man was Robert Ballard. As a child, Ballard was obsessed with the ocean. This fascination started when he was just 12 years old. That's when he watched a film adaptation of Jules Verne's science fiction novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It had everything to spark a young person's imagination, from adventure and strange creatures to a powerful underwater vehicle called the Nautilus. It could travel anywhere in the world you wanted to go. From that moment, life on dry land was no longer in Ballard's future. When he was 23, he was assigned to the Deep Submergence Group. There, he helped develop techniques to search the ocean floor. His biggest accomplishment was the creation of Alvin. It was a small, easy-to-maneuver submarine that could carry 3 people. It also featured an external mechanical arm designed to gather underwater samples while the crew remained safe and dry inside. Alvin the submarine quickly proved useful for a variety of tasks. For example, once it was used to track down an aircraft that had crashed into the sea. But the vessel experienced a series of setbacks. In one case, it was attacked by a swordfish, which caused the submarine to resurface quickly. The swordfish, still stuck in the outer skin of the submarine, became that night's dinner. And in October 1968, the submarine was being lowered into the water when the cables holding it snapped, sending it careening into the ocean, along with 3 crew members on board. And because the small vessel was still open, it immediately filled with water and quickly began to sink. Luckily, the crew managed to escape, but Alvin was gone. Bad weather hampered multiple attempts to recover the vessel. It wasn't until the following year that it was finally returned to the surface. In time, Alvin would be improved. Its hull would be strengthened by titanium, giving it a higher depth rating, thus making it even better suited for ocean exploration. The specialized submarine would come in handy in many of Ballard's 100-plus expeditions. The man was one of the first to explore an underwater mountain chain called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. And when he found thermal vents in the Galapagos Rift in the late 70s, he also helped discover and document the process of chemosynthesis. That's a complicated chemical synthesis of food energy by bacteria. But his biggest discovery was still to come. Ballard claimed he'd never been a Titanic fanatic, but he eventually became obsessed with finding the ship after watching other explorers try and fail. As he said, Titanic was clearly the big Mount Everest at the time. Many others had tried, many that I thought would have succeeded, or should have succeeded but didn't. Ballard began thinking about finding the ship as early as 1973, and 4 years later, he actually made an attempt. He used the deep-sea salvage vessel Sea Probe, which was a drill ship equipped with cameras and sonar. But he was forced to give up when the drilling pipe broke. It just wasn't his time. In the early 80s, a Texas oil man named Jack Grimm tried to find the wreck on 3 different occasions. Once, Grimm was actually right over the Titanic, but his equipment failed to detect it. That's what we call extreme bad luck. Ballard was just biding his time. He needed a plan and some help. The first issue was getting down to the bottom of the Atlantic. The furthest down he had ever traveled before was 20,000 feet, and this trip took him 3 hours, and that didn't include the way back up. Ballard knew he could use Alvin, already enhanced with a titanium hull to withstand the pressure of the ocean. But he also needed something that didn't require him to actually go down with it. An unpiloted, remote-controlled submarine would be ideal. But first, he would have to create one. He reached out to the authorities, hoping they would provide funding for his project. And though officials had no interest in the Titanic, they were willing to help. But there was a catch. Ballard had to first focus on tracking down 2 submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, which had sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the 1960s. The authorities were hoping to study them to find out why they had sunk in the first place. They also wanted to know if they could be recovered or if it was safe to leave them on the ocean floor. Only when he had successfully completed this task would he be free to use any remaining time on his contract to find the Titanic. With no other options for funding, Ballard took the offer. He got to work. First, he created 2 new devices. Argo was an unpiloted, deep-towed undersea video camera sled. It was designed to take photos and record videos from a series of cameras mounted on it. It could work at depths of up to 20,000 feet, and it could also explore nearly 98% of the ocean floor. Argo was supposed to be tethered to a boat. As the boat moved, Argo would be pulled behind, floating just above the ocean floor. The camera would then transmit images to the surface. The second device was a small robotic vehicle called Jason Jr. It was also controlled remotely, which allowed the crew inside a submarine, like Alvin, to get closer to and photograph underwater objects. Ballard was now ready. He knew he had to find those submarines quickly, and it didn't take him long. Much to his relief, the search was relatively simple, and he was able to fulfill his obligations with 12 days to spare. With almost 2 weeks to devote to finding the Titanic, he set out to explore the ocean. He focused the search close to Newfoundland, Canada, pulling Argo along the ocean floor and reviewing the images it collected. And after a few days of nothing, they eventually found riveted hull plates and a boiler. Could this be it? The next day, a ship's large bow was revealed. On September 1st, 1985, Ballard and his fellow crew members realized they had finally found the infamous ship. The discovery resulted in a mix of emotions. Ballard was excited to be the first to find the Titanic's final resting place, but he was also overwhelmed by the sense of grief for those who had suffered when the ship had gone down. Over the next 4 days, the crew explored the wreck. They found the crow's nest, from where the iceberg had first been spotted. Plus, there was finally evidence of how the massive ship had split in 2 before sinking, with both halves of the ship found. There was furniture and dinnerware, and sadly, several leather shoes of those who hadn't made it to safety were scattered about the ocean floor. Ballard succeeded where others had failed and became an instant celebrity around the world. You'd think that locating the Titanic would be enough for one man, but not for Ballard. In 2019, he took on the challenge of solving another mystery, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Earhart had attempted to be the first woman to fly around the world. Unfortunately, she disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean in 1937. She and her plane were never found. Ballard hoped that his luck with the Titanic would help with finding where Earhart had gone down, but his expedition failed to find anything. And though Robert Ballard has found more shipwrecks than anybody else, it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's estimated that there are over 3 million shipwrecks in the ocean, and Ballard has only located 100 of them. Now, in his late 70s, the man is hoping to encourage young people to continue his work of exploring the ocean and its many mysteries. In 1989, he started the Jason Learning Project to inspire grade school students to pursue science, technology, engineering, and math. He has his own research vessel called the EV Nautilus, after the name of the submarine in Jules Verne's novel, a fitting tribute to the story that inspired his career.